For the first time since June of last year, Canada's annual inflation rate fell below 3%. New data released by Statistics Canada shows inflation clocking in at 2.9% in January. That's down from 3.4% in December. The largest contribution to the drop, lower year-over-year prices for gasoline. Today's data is raising expectations the Bank of Canada could start cutting benchmark rates in the coming months. Jimmy Jean is the chief economist at Desjardins. Armin Yalnizyan is the Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers at the Atkinson Foundation. They join me now. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Jimmy, let's start with your thoughts, Jimmy, on the data released today. What does 2.9%? What does that tell us about Canada's fight against inflation?
Well, I think it means that we're back in the 1 to 3% range, and that's the Bank of Canada's operational range. You have a number of provinces. You have 3 provinces that are seeing their inflation rates below 2%, so below the target. And you actually have 8 provinces that have inflation at or below 3%. And in the largest province in Ontario, inflation is now at 2.7%. So, that's one way to look at it. But, when you look at what produces this inflation, you see a lot of consumer goods, clothing. You see food, which has been a contentious issue. It went from 11.4% a year ago and now to 3.4%. So things have been going in the right direction. And, monetary policy is working as intended. So that's why, the question of rate cuts will come, I think, sooner rather than later.
Armin, what's your analysis of today?
Well, first of all, affordability is still on everybody's mind, because even though things are moving in the right direction in terms of how fast prices are going up, they're still going up. And in fact, the wages seem to pick up in the last few months, outstripping headline inflation. The cost of gasoline, the cost of shelter, specifically mortgage rates, and food are still higher than average wage gains since January of 2020. So people are worse off. And this is now starting to escalate for renters. The biggest single cost increase was mortgage rate costs in the last few years. And that's got a lot to do with interest rates, which is exactly what Premier Eby was talking about at the top of your show.
Okay, I want to get to that in just a second, but before we talk shelter, I want to talk food. Because Jimmy, you put the numbers out there. It's moving in the right direction. It's a little bit above 3.4%, I believe is where it is. How do you explain this big change in food inflation? Because the last I checked, there's still a carbon tax. Galen Weston is still running Loblaw, and yet the rate of food inflation is coming down. What are the inputs that is changing food prices?
Well, we've been expecting food prices to cool just because of the international context. We've seen, internationally traded foodstuff actually decline and a while ago, and it was really strange how long it took for Canadian grocery prices to follow that trend. So it seems like we're finally seeing some of that. Perhaps the political pressure has also contributed, but those that kind of food price inflation, that's also consistent with what we've been seeing in the U.S. Food was not going to rise for forever. It's still rising. To Armin's point, we're not seeing this deflation, outright deflation in grocery prices, but it's really going in the right direction. And if the international trend is a guide, it should continue in that direction.
Armin, what's your sense of that on food, right? Because it has become such a big political issue over the past year with everybody sort of picking their pet cause. Is it just the international picture, as Jimmy lays out, that really Canada's coming into alignment with global food prices?
I mean, everybody's losing their mind because it's going in this, quote, right direction, but it's still going up. So like to Jimmy's point, there's very few food items that are seeing a decrease in prices. And usually we see some kind of like explosion of sales in January because everybody's blown their wad in December. So the stores are very kind to us in January. We'll see what it looks like in February. And frankly, not just food, but what is happening globally right now is maybe higher costs. To ship a container of manufactured goods or even parts for manufactured goods from China now is triple the cost it was a few months ago because of what's happening in the Panama Canal and what's happening in the Suez. And we don't know if this is going to escalate. So this is like Yeah, maybe we've got a sweet spot right now, a Goldilocks moment where things are starting to come in the Bank of Canada's target range. Was it because of what the Bank of Canada did? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe there were other forces. This whole idea that, the Bank of Canada's interest rate policy is working, I think the jury's still out on that.
Well, let's just go back to the issue you started with a minute ago, Armin, and stick with you. And this is the shelter costs, right? Rent is up 7.9%, according to StatsCan. Mortgages are up 27%. And a big input into that, as you heard from Premier Eby, is interest rates. So that is factoring into the headline inflation as well as just the shelter inflation. So how do you approach that as a central bank, if obviously interest rates are a key input into those costs going so high?
I just want to tell you, David, I wouldn't want to be a central banker these days because it seems like whether you do or whether you don't, you're kind of stuck. If you cut rates right now, you're going to feed price inflation because there'll be more demand on the market. If you keep rates up, you're going to, well, no matter what we do, we're going to see about half of the mortgages that are out on the market need to be refinanced in 2024, 2025. So we've only gone through about half the pain of refinancing. And, the rates aren't going to come back down to when those mortgages were first issued. So we're going to see a lot more pain on that front. And when you take a look at all of the factors in the CPI basket, the fastest rising factor, not just in the last year, but in the last 4 years, when you compare where people were at 4 years ago in January of 2020, the biggest price increase has been mortgage costs. And right behind it was gasoline.
Right.
And who knows what OPEC's going to do. And right behind that is rents, because what happens in the mortgage market cascades into the rental market. You're between a rock and a hard place as a central banker right now.
So Jimmy, how do we look at what's happening on shelter and look at what's happening on housing and on rent and factor that into whatever prognostication there may be for what the central bank is going to do? I mean, at what point does Tiff Macklem have to look at this and say, monetary policy might be keeping inflation high because of its impact on this specific massive driver?
Yeah, well, they know about this. I mean, they've known even from the start. This is the standard prescription to get inflation down, is that you need to get that inflation, that mechanical inflation effect in the shelter component in order to get that squeeze that Armin was referring to, that produces those spending cutbacks and that produces that disinflation in other areas. And, what we've seen in 2023 and early 2024 speaks to that process unfolding as it was intended. And, we think that by the end of this year, we should be at 2%, even with that stickiness in the shelter component. And by the way, when the Bank of Canada will start cutting interest rates, it will provide relief on that front as well. So I think the Bank of Canada has a number of core measures that, abstract from that influence. They know where to look for in order to understand the impact of their policies, what they can control on inflation. I think all this is working. And the danger here is that it works too much and that the Bank of Canada ends up penalizing investment in particular. And we don't want that. We need a ton of investment, in particular in housing. And that's why the Bank of Canada needs to manage that risk as well of maintaining rates too high for too long.
So what's your sense then, Jimmy, just as a final point from you on when you think they will start the recalibration? A lot of people are looking to the March decision. Do you think it's more like June? When do you think we're going to see some kind of relief from the Bank of Canada on this based on the trajectory of the most recent data?
Yeah, so I think in March, they will simply open the door. They've already started saying, well, we're unlikely to hike rates further, but now I think they might open the door a little bit further. April, I think, is in play. Our baseline forecast is June, but obviously if we have some data that confirms economic weakness or weakness in the job market or further inflation prints that surprise positively, they could easily start going in April. So for now, we say June, but markets are saying it's about 50-50 between April and June.
Armin, I know you say you wouldn't want to be a central banker, but I'm going to ask you to play one on TV. When do you think we're going to start seeing any kind of downward trajectory on rates from Tiff Macklem and the bank?
Well, I'm not a betting gal, David, so I'm not going to place my bets on March or June because what we are seeing right now globally is potentially more cost pressures from shipping of manufactured goods and from further like spreading of problems. And don't forget, 2024 is the year where half the world goes to the vote to the ballot box to vote in their next leaders. And in every country where there's an election, there's an autocrat on the menu, and every autocrat is about my country first, which only raises costs. So I'm certainly not assuming that things are going to turn around because our inflation rate this month is in the 1 to 3% zone. But to Jimmy's point, if they don't reduce rates, they can't do what they just said a few weeks ago, which is it's not our fault that, housing prices are so high. It's demand and supply. Well, like if you're throttling the ability for supply to come on stream, you do have some guilt to bear, I think, that story. It isn't just a matter of cooling the economy, but I wouldn't agree with Jimmy that for sure what the central bank is doing is the reason we are in that sweet spot, 1 to 3%. It is supply. It isn't interest rates. It isn't cooling of demand. People are spending a lot of money on the basics, and it's getting out of reach.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We'll check in as we get closer to the next bank decision. Thank you so much, Jimmy Zhang and Armin Yalnizyan. Thank you for your time today.